Reconstructing philosophy.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Reconstructing Philosophy podcast. It's been a few months, but I'm back, and today we're going to be talking about love. My guest today is Dr. Gary Foster, Associate Professor of Philosophy from Wilfrid Laurier University and the Chair of the Department. Gary's work is primarily focused on love and personal identity, moral psychology, existentialism, and the work of Jean-Paul Sartre. And today we're going to be talking about some of his research on the topic of love. Welcome, Gary.
Thanks, Matt. Good to be here.
It's nice having you. It's actually interesting because you're the first prof that I've had on this podcast, as opposed to grad students. So
cool. Great.
So you're the first. So before let's jump in, I guess. So in a second, I'm going to ask you what got you into philosophy, but first I want to ask you what attracts you to talking about philosophical issues about love?
Well, I guess what attracts me to talking about philosophical issues about love, I suppose, and I guess this is a bit of a Nietzschean angle on it, but I suppose in some sense I feel like in philosophy, a lot of philosophy, and even though we as philosophers try to take an objective or detached attitude towards things, a lot of things in philosophy have a personal dimension, and certainly the topic of love and my interest in the topic of love has a personal side to it as well. But I think my getting into talking about love just started one day when a former chair in the Department of Philosophy at Laurier, Rocky Jacobson, asked me if I would teach a course on philosophy of sex, love, and friendship. At that time, I didn't know a lot about this area, philosophy of love. But I found as I started teaching the course, I found that I found the material really engaging, really interesting, and it kind of went from there. And I started writing papers and exploring the topic a lot further.
Isn't that funny? I feel like there's so many philosophers who kind of stumble into something that becomes a kind of lifelong passion topic for them. They're in philosophy and they're doing something else, and then some kind of fluke thing comes along and says, "Hey, do you want to look at this issue?" And then you kind of fall in love with it. It's kind of funny that way that seems to happen to philosophers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some people find that passion in their grad school research and their PhD research, but for some of us, I mean, as much as we enjoy the process and the time that we spend doing our PhD, our real passion or interest in philosophy sometimes comes into the picture later, and it you build into that your previous academic experiences. But sometimes it takes a while longer to find your real interest.
So how did you end up getting into philosophy in the first place? So what kind of things ended up sort of influencing what you eventually wanted to study?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think about this now and then. In my earlier days, I didn't really have much contact with or much of an understanding of what the parameters of philosophy were. I grew up in a sort of somewhat religious background. I went to study theology at a certain point, and this is not so uncommon, because I've heard this story from other philosophers. I think while I was studying theology, I started reading philosophy, and I kind of found a certain similarity in the kinds of questions, the kinds of things that both philosophy and theology explored, but they explored them from often from a very different angle from a very different perspective. And I think when I started reading philosophy, something clicked in me. Something. I got that feeling that this is what I'm really interested in. Right? Theology was interesting, but philosophy was what I was really interested in. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard was one of those philosophers that was a bit of a bridge for me between theology and philosophy. But once I get into philosophy, I found that there was sort of no real turning back. It occurred to me that I wanted to see where this, I wanted to see where this led to, because it became a passion very quickly. Yeah.
It's funny. I feel like that happens, to a lot of philosophers, where you're kind of almost tangentially interested in something else, but then philosophy touches on it, and you're like, well, that's a really interesting way to look at that. So, and then you kind of you end up sort of diving headfirst into that.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I had you send me some of your research that you're doing, and interestingly enough, so the topic is about love, and so some philosophers who study love seem to find themselves wading into the issue because they're talking about, love, and they're trying to figure out, what it is that we love when we say we love something. And then there are other philosophers who deal with things like personal identity, who find themselves sort of stumbling into conversations about love. And your work seems to bridge these two sort of separate conversations that are really kind of essentially about the same issue. So can you explain a little bit why philosophers are so concerned about the issue of what it is that we love when we claim that we love someone?
Yes, I do. Listen, I love someone.
Yes?
Someone who does not know.
Yes.
Someone who loves me too, but is afraid of me and keeps away and never says one word.
Yeah. I mean, as my work in philosophy of love evolved, I discovered that I had this other interest, evolving interest, which was in sort of philosophy of personal identity, and I found some interesting questions, discussions, debates in philosophers like Derek Parfit. Even Harry Frankfurt, who sort of does work in both love and personal identity, Christine Korsgaard and others. And I found that there was something interesting about the way that the differences and the similarities between the way that the philosophers working in the philosophy of love, the way that they dealt with certain questions concerning love, and the way that philosophers working in the area of personal identity, the way that they handled questions. Some philosophers in the philosophy of love would come across the question, or would pose the question, what the object of love is, without taking the further step and linking it to a notion of personal identity, whereas certain philosophers who worked on personal identity would raise questions about love and the object of love without really seriously engaging in theories of love or ideas about what love is, what the structure of love is, or what the focus of love is. It seemed to me, even though these two approaches do pose different questions, it seems to me that there was certainly room for an interesting discussion, an interesting exploration by bringing these two together. The reason why I say they pose different questions, really, when philosophers of love ask the question of what the object of love is, they're not primarily concerned about an entity, a metaphysical entity or object in the world independent of love, even if we might think that such an entity is implied. They're more concerned about what we might call the intentional focus of love. So philosophers of love have sometimes divided, have had debates about whether love is aimed at or motivated by the properties of the beloved.
Yes.
And such a man. He is proud, noble, young, brave, beautiful.
Beautiful.
Or whether love is aimed at something else, something that goes beyond the properties of the beloved. Whereas when I'm thinking, for example, Derek Parfit, philosophers who do love, who do work on personal identity, when they introduce the question about love and the issue of love, as Parfit does in a small section of his book, Reasons and Persons, they're primarily their notion of love, or their idea of love, in some sense, is shaped by how they conceive of a person. So the philosopher of personal identity is concerned primarily with what a person is and the implications for ethics and the implications for love once you have an idea of a person and what a person is. Whereas the philosophers of love tend to be more focused on what love is and how love works. Then they try to fit the person or the object of love, because we may love other things besides persons. We may love our pets. We may love our country. We may love a number of objects. But I've been primarily focused on the idea of personal love. So this is why this question of the relation between love and personal identity has become important for me.
I do want to ask you about a bit more specifically about some of the people you mentioned, but I also find it kind of interesting just as an academic issue, in terms of the fact that you have essentially different kinds of, if you want to call them communities, or different philosophers sort of stumbling upon the similar questions, but from very different sort of perspectives and contexts in terms of what they're trying to investigate. So I'm just, before we move on to the specifics and the nitty gritty, I'm curious, do you think that there's do you think that there's a sort of fundamental difference, or that there is a sort of commonality between the two different perspectives, that philosophers who are primarily concerned with personal identity and then delve into issues of love, do you think that they have a sort of fundamentally different sort of perspective overall than the person who tries to study love and then wades into the issue of personal identity? Because they're kind of coming at it from very different sort of approaches, right? So do you think that there's sort of something common to each approach, or do you think that that's not really as relevant?
Yeah, well, I think you raised a very good question. I think that their intention, their aim, is different. I think that they are what they're exploring. For instance, what Derek Parfit is exploring versus what someone like Alan Sobel or Harry Frankfurt or David Velleman are exploring are different. I mean, the latter three, Velleman, Frankfurt, Sobel, are really concerned with love, theory of love, ideas about love, the structure of love, and love's object. Where someone like Parfit or even Bernard Williams, when they discuss personal identity, they're concerned with questions about personal identity. So they're what I want to call the primary aims are quite different. But what I've tried to do in my own work is I've come across areas of their work where each of them raise these other issues, right? These other issues tend to be subordinate to the primary issue. In Parfit's case, the metaphysics of personal identity, or in Williams' case, similarly, the metaphysics of personal identity. In Sobel or Velleman's case, the structure, sometimes even the phenomenology of love. So their aims are different, but when what I find interesting is when they raise questions about the other area. When Bernard Williams raises the question about our idea of love, and this is something that Derek Parfit, discusses quite a bit in that section I referred to. When he raises that issue, both Williams and Frankfurt make certain assumptions about what love is. Even though they're primarily concerned about personal identity, they raise certain questions about what love is, that I think begins to forge a link between these two discussions, right? Likewise, when in the chapter of his book, I think it's chapter 10, I can't remember, chapter 10 or 11 of his book, The Structure of Love, when Alan Sobel, the chapter's titled The Object of Love, when he tries to identify what the object of personal love is, he comes very close to presenting a theory of personal identity, even though that's not his aim, right? And so I find it, because not a lot of people that I'm aware of, and I've read quite a bit in this area, not many people have tried to wed those two questions together, those two issues together. So I found these issues that people like Sobel and like I said, David Bellman, and then on the one hand, and Williams and Parfit on the other. I find that when they raise this question, they open the door to a very fruitful discussion, a fruitful interchange between these two topics, right? Because one, even though in terms of the discussion of the philosophy of love, even though the primary focus isn't personal identity, it would seem strange if, when we talk about the object of personal love being a person, and we Christopher Grau makes this point in an article in the Southern Journal of Philosophy. It would be strange if there wasn't at least some tentative idea of what we mean by persons, what we mean by a person when we talk about the person as an object of love.
I find that really interesting, and again, before we move on and maybe dig into more specifically some of the issues that they're talking about, do you think that there's a chance that that perhaps it's not such a great idea to link those kind of conversations? Because I definitely see the upside that you're talking about, but is it possible that when we talk about personal identity in the context of love, it's just kind of a fundamentally different notion? And I wonder if perhaps part of that is based on the idea that when we love somebody, it's always based off of what the other person's sense of what their identity is, as opposed to when philosophers talk about personal identity just as its own thing, they're usually talking about our own sense of our personal identity. Whereas love is, when you're talking about loving somebody, it's based off of what the other person sort of perceives. So do you think that perhaps there's do you think that there's any kind of fundamental difference that might make any kind of crossover between the debate perhaps not, it may not make as much sense to talk about those things in the same way, or is there any potential downside, I guess? I think,
I think you're, I think I get what you're asking, and I think you're right. I mean, I think there's potentially problems. It's fraught with potential misunderstandings, equivocations. There's a chance that because both sides of the issue aren't always asking the same kinds of questions, then there's often a potential for misunderstanding, a potential for that's why a potential for the whole thing to not work, right? That's why I think I've kept my aims, most of my aims, somewhat modest, and I've really tried to work on certain what I see as individual problems or puzzles related to personal identity, especially personal identity as it relates to love. But on my less modest or less ambitious days, or my attempts, I've tried to bridge some of that discussion while acknowledging some of the problems in an idea of a metaphysical conception of personal identity. I've often moved the discussion in the direction of something like a notion of practical identity, which I think when we start moving to a notion like a practical identity and a phenomenology of love, then I think we get into, if I've understood what you're asking correctly, we get into some of the territory that you were talking about. We get into not just a unilateral idea of love, where the lover has an image or a conception of the beloved, the object of love. But we get into a relational kind of understanding of love, where when someone loves another person, loves them, if we might use the phrase, for who they are, they're not loving them for some essence, some substantive thing, a Cartesian ego or a soul or whatever, but they're loving them in a relational way, whereby what we call the beloved, the object of love, is not just sort of this passive person to be experienced by the lover, but who themselves expresses, projects in a practical identity that to which the lover responds, right? So it becomes the discussion, and this is in the manuscript that I've been working on. This is sort of the direction that I move in, and I do to a certain degree in some of the articles I've written too. It moves from a more metaphysically based discussion to a practically based discussion, one that I don't think necessarily violates any of the principles that are laid down in some of the metaphysical discussions, but rather challenges, sort of certain conception of identity, based on their adequacy with relation to how we experience other people, right? In our love relationships.
I really think that the kinds of connections that you're making are really interesting. But I just wanted to ask, because I'm always interested in how, thinking about why academics use certain concepts in certain contexts and how that might differ in different contexts. But in terms of the primary people that you're researching, right? So you have kind of an array of different views on this notion of what it is that we love when we love somebody, right? So someone like Sobel thinks that when we love somebody, we just sort of love the individual sort of empirical properties that make up that person, and that somehow in the aggregate and collectively they make up the person that we love, right? And then there are people like Velleman, who seems to think that what we actually love is the sort of kind of true self that lies beyond our empirical persona, right, through that kind of conduit. So do we love the sort of empirical properties that we sort of experience, or is there something more sort of kind of fundamental that lies beyond those properties? Because it would seem kind of strange to say that we just love properties or something like that. But on the other hand, you have this similar problem where you go, well, where is this transcendental self, and how do you find it, and all this other kind of stuff. And what I really find interesting is what you sort of lay out in your paper, which is this notion of the embodied self. So can you explain? I think you already were a little bit, but can you explain just a little bit more what you mean by the embodied self, and how you think that offers a sort of better alternative to people like Velleman and Sobel?
Yeah, and I recognize. I sort of just wanted to acknowledge your previous point. I think you're quite right to recognize these when you bring in different schools of philosophy, they're different approaches to philosophy. It muddies the picture a bit, right? And I tried hard to kind of show how I've been addressing the problems from each perspective, whether it's phenomenological, metaphysical, practical, and so on. So I recognize that, and this is where I think I had to be careful in the question you asked in responding to Sobel and responding to Velleman, because what Velleman sometimes means by a certain term isn't exactly what for instance Sobel means by a certain term.
Yeah, man.
Right? And when and to be clear, Sobel does say that the object of love is a person as opposed to their properties. He makes this distinction between the ground of love and the object of love. The ground of love is a person's properties, attractive qualities. The object of love is a person, but as you rightly say, what he means by a person turns out to be only, when you read carefully through his chapter on the object of love, what it turns out to mean is simply a collection of those properties, not any of those individual properties, right? So what we love as a person, but what that means is we love this collection and not individual properties, right? Velleman does this interesting thing with his sort of Kantian view of love. He talks about, even though he isn't unlike Sobel, he's not trying to answer the question primarily about the object of love. He does give us a picture whereby we can deduce what he thinks the object of love is. He tells us when we love someone, we love them by virtue of the value they have as an instance of irrational nature. And this is an instance of irrational nature in a Kantian sense, right? So not just as a reasoner, but so not just our capacity for reason, but our capacity for valuation, as Velleman puts it. So what is Velleman? Is Velleman concerned with the ground of love or the object of love there, right? In one sense, it seems that he's concerned with the ground of love in that he thinks that the ground of love is not properties, but it's the value, that we possess by virtue of being an instance of irrational nature. Now, Velleman makes this interesting. So when you look at it that way, and he admits in Kantian fashion that everyone is of equal value by virtue of being an instance of irrational nature, and everyone is entitled to respect, right, in the Kantian sense, by virtue of being an instance of irrational nature. He also suggests that everyone is, in some sense, a worthy object of love, right? Now, he does recognize that this poses a problem because just because everyone is a worthy object of love doesn't seem to automatically translate into everyone being loved, right? And it feels to me like he sees this problem, and he sees that different people, some people are loved more than others, or some people become the objects of love and other people don't. And so I feel like he tries to somehow fix this situation, right? So he draws this distinction between a person as an instance of irrational nature and the person's empirical persona, right? One's empirical persona is what differentiates us as human beings, right? Our empirical persona includes, sort of our sense of style, our Velleman suggests even things like the way we walk, the way we sip our tea, whatever. All of these things that we'd normally think as things that we're attracted to. We'd normally think. Many of us think of it in an ordinary way, in the way that Sobel might, that we're attracted to qualities of a person. Velleman's characterization of that is not that we're, he doesn't accept that way of thinking about it in terms of the ground of love and the object of love in the way that Sobel does. He doesn't think that we, that the ground of love is the qualities of the person and the object of love is the person themselves. What Velleman says is something different. He says a person's empirical persona acts as a conduit for expressing one's true nature, one's nature oneself as an instance of a rational nature.
Why, for all you know, the man may be a savage or a fool.
Not with such eyes. I read his soul in them.
Yes, all our souls are written in our eyes.
He tells us that, not everyone, even though everyone is in some sense entitled to love, or I don't know if entitled is quite it, but everyone is worthy of love, just like everyone's worthy of respect. We are not all equally able to express our personhood through our empirical persona. We're not able to express it equally. And as a potential lover, we're not always good at interpreting the empirical persona of others in order to see their true personhood.
Speak to me.
I love you.
Yes, speak to me of love.
I love you.
Now be eloquent, be brilliant for me. Tonight of all nights.
I love you so.
You have your thing. Now improvise, rhapsodize.
I love you very much.
So Velleman creates this what I want to call a gap between our empirical persona and our what he calls our true nature, our true self, our self as an instance of a rational nature. And the picture of embodied personhood, or the embodied object of love that I try to develop in my work, is an attempt to sort of close that gap or overcome that gap. Even though Velleman's not, I don't think, trying to explicitly to introduce a kind of a substantive dualism or anything like that, it certainly has echoes of that kind of dualistic picture of the self, where that's sort of been part of the Kantian, Platonic, Christian tradition, where the true object of love is the soul, or that inner self, and the body is this almost illegitimate, object, or just an object of sexual desire or something like that. So I approach this in terms of, by presenting this picture of an embodied self, to address that gap in Velleman, but also to address another problem in Sobel. Sobel, in telling us that, when we love a person, what we love is a collection of properties or collection of qualities. He even says things like, by loving someone amounts to their positive properties outweighing their negative properties, right? He kind of gives us this an explanation for, the motivation for love. Something seems quite abstract about that to me, right? As if one can abstract these qualities or properties from a person in order to understand what love is, right? So, in other words, if I add up all the positive qualities of Mary, right, her beautiful blonde hair, her great intelligence, her sense of humor, and then subtract all the negative qualities, somehow I can, this will amount to me having a reason or motivation to love her. But it seems to me that, and likewise, when it comes to the issue in philosophy of love of replaceability or fungibility, if I list all the qualities of Mary and then list all the qualities of Lisa, I might be able to replace Mary by Lisa, because just like Mary, Lisa has intelligence and blonde hair and a good sense of humor, but properties of people aren't like that. They're not like trading cards, or when I talk about a person's intelligence or their sense of humor or their blonde hair or whatever, I'm talking not about these abstract qualities, but I'm talking about Lisa's intelligence, Lisa's sense of humor, Lisa's, they're embodied in that person who's Lisa, right? They're not something that I can abstract from her.
It's interesting. I mean, it's almost an account of love that sounds like it would be a perfect account of love for like a utilitarian, right?
You mean the measuring the properties kind of?
Yeah, just by sort of, assuming that you could sort of rank them like that and make a decision. I'm curious though, have you, because I find it really interesting, I really like some of the points that you make about, looking at properties and abstraction and abstracting properties away from people. And because on the one hand, you have this kind of conception of almost the self or even of experience, as if we just sort of, in that sort of old empiricists notion that we just sort of experience, properties in isolation, and then we sort of all put them together in our brain. I'm curious, are you familiar with John Dewey or the Pragmatist or anything like that?
I'm a bit, but I must confess, I have a couple of books by Dewey sitting on my shelf, and I always intend to, I always intend to read them. I've read a little bit of Dewey, but it was a long time ago, so I can't speak with any memory or authority on Dewey.
It's kind of really interesting, just because he in terms of his arguments about epistemology and knowledge and stuff like that, he argues that, what we experience when we experience the world is a sort of unified whole, and we abstract out of that unified whole for the purpose of inquiry to,
yes,
find out these qualities and see where they go and what they mean and what consequences they might have. So I really like the argument that you make that we shouldn't sort of hypostatize the self in this way, where you sort of think about the physical qualities and the sort of mental or inner qualities apart from each other, because that's not really how we experience our beloved. We experience them as a sort of unified thing, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think Dewey's quite right on that, and I'm very sympathetic to that line of thinking. I think philosophers abstract; they break things down and for the purpose of explanation and understanding, and I think that's totally legitimate. But what happens, I think, sometimes they draw conclusions. They forget to put it all back together again when they draw conclusions about practical life, about everyday life, and including love relationships or ethical relationships. And I think that's where the abstraction becomes a problem. Abstraction itself is not the problem. It's part of how we understand things. But we forget to put the thing back together again, I guess.
Well, and we tend to confuse the thing that we're abstracting for what it is just by itself. We kind of reify it and say, well, it just is that thing, because you can pull all those things apart, but that doesn't it doesn't just mean that that's what it is, right?
Yes. Yeah.
What you said earlier, and this conversation too, I wanted to ask you, why do you think that so many philosophers tend to still be very beholden to this kind of sort of tradition, as you mentioned, the sort of Christian tradition of sort of diminishing the body in favor of the sort of mental or inner self or soul? Why do you think that that's still such a common reaction amongst philosophers?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I suppose I can only speculate, and I mean, in fairness, I mean, if you were to ask Parfit, or you ask any of these philosophers who I've suggested, who I've suggested that the work reflects this, I'm sure Parfit's dead now, but of course, if he was alive, I'm sure they would be horrified at the very thought that, that's what they're doing, right? Because they tend to reject that tradition. And one of Parfit's explicit targets of his own form of reductionism is the idea of the Cartesian ego, is this idea that there's a... So in one sense, he's very much rejecting this idea. But in another sense, I think that privileging or that prioritizing of the mental life over the physical body and so on, it's very prominent in a thinker like Parfit and in other thinkers as well. And the easy answer, I suppose, is to say that the pull or the influence of the tradition in which which our philosophical, our philosophical tradition or philosophical and religious tradition is stronger than or more subtle or more pervasive than we actually acknowledge. I mean, that's an easy answer, and that might be true. There might be some element of that. I want to suggest that at least echoes of that, whether they wanted that result or not. There's certainly, there's certainly very much. And Parfit says it. He seems to have little. His focus on what really matters is, sort of one's mental life, one's psychological connection and or continuity, as he puts it, relation, what he calls relation R, and it doesn't matter essentially to Parfit if it's in one body or another. Now, for psychological reasons, he suggests that, well, if that personhood, that psychological mental person, if they're transferred to a body that's not similar to one's original body, that might cause the lover to react differently, right? That might cause the person themselves to react differently if they're in a different kind of body. So he recognizes that we might not fit well into certain bodies, but the concern doesn't seem to be that seems to be the main concern about why we wouldn't want to have our mind or our personality transformed into another body. It's not the fact that it's another body, right? The body doesn't seem to be really to matter so much. I think the same is in a different way. I think the same is true of Velleman, right? The empirical persona plays an important role for Velleman, but it does seem to be subordinate to what he calls one's rational nature, or Kantian instance of a rational nature. That empirical persona becomes a means, a conduit for expressing that rational nature, which is the true object of respect and the true object of love. I get it. As a philosopher, I get it. We value the mind, right? You know what I mean? That seems to be the important. And we do, in our tradition, we do think that for good reasons, I think, for some good reasons, that a person's intellect, their aesthetic tastes, their personality, their sense of humor, we see those as very valuable. And I'm not downplaying the value of those, because I think they are valuable. But it's really the detaching it. It's really the thought experiments and the accounts that separate that from the body, that strike me as problematic, right? Because the body is, as Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the French phenomenologist, suggests, is an expressive space. It's when I engage with someone and they make me laugh, it's not just what they say, it's not just mentally what they're thinking, it's their expressions, right? And those expressions I don't think those expressions are just a tool for their humor. Those expressions are part of the humor, right? And somehow we make this somewhat artificial separation, right? Again, as we said before, and as you suggested in the case of Dewey, for the purposes of explanation, but we forget to put it back together again.
And we sometimes forget that we're trying to explain something in a context, and we just think that we're describing it regardless of context, right?
Yeah, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, I think that's quite right. Yeah.
I do want to get to some of the issues about like replication and fungibility in a second, but I have a few other questions that just sort of, I think, more general questions about sort of what we're talking about. So we're talking about personal love, right? We're not talking about, a love that you might have for like an inanimate object or something like that, right?
Right.
Would that so does that just include like romantic love, or what about like familial love, or like the love that a parent would have towards a child?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. I mean, I tended to focus on romantic love or mature adult love, between. But I've also at times talked about familial love or love for a friend, friendship love, or love for a child. It's interesting because the kind of well-known American philosopher Harry Frankfurt presents a conception of love that has been fairly influential, and his concept and Frankfurt gives us sort of a concept of love that he takes to be the sort of central or the most sort of important kind of love, and the structure of that love is very much the structure of Frankfurt's conception of love is very much patterned after the sort of the paradigm of that is the sort of the parent-child relationship, right? Historically speaking, his conception of love falls under what Alan Sobel calls the agapic conception of love. The idea that love is, and Irving Singer also talked about this, the idea that love is a bestowal of value on the beloved. Frankfurt says something to the effect of, I don't love my child because they have valuable properties. My child is valuable because I love them, right? In other words, the parents' love for their child is what, in some sense, it's in loving their child that the child becomes valuable to them, right? It's not that their child, their child's properties are somehow greater than another child, and therefore that's why they love them, right? They would love them regardless of what their child was like, right? That, historically speaking, that kind of has echoes of this idea of God's love, right? In the Judeo-Christian tradition, that God loves God. The ground of God's love is not the properties of human beings. The ground of love is in God's nature, that God bestows love upon humankind who are unworthy of that love, right? So Frankfurt gives us a paradigm of love that is, really modeled, the paradigm of love that's really based on the parent-child relationship. He seems to suggest that, at times he seems to almost suggest that love differs in degrees. This is the sort of paradigmatic form of pure love, and other forms of love tend to be lesser in degree, in some sense, somewhat less in kind too, but less in degree. Whereas other pluralists about love, I'm thinking of Irving Singer, tend to think of love as, tend to think more in terms of different kinds of love, whether it be romantic love or parental love or friendship love, and not positioning one form of love as being purer than others. There's a lot of similarities between friendship love and romantic love in terms of at least a desire for, even if historically it hasn't been there, there's a desire for equality of some sort. There at least seems to be, depending on how one wants to define equality. Aristotle has a whole discussion about that in his work on friendship, his discussion of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics. But the similarities between romantic love and friendship love in terms of the at least idea or the aim of equality. And of course, romantic love differs typically from friendship love in that it's also tends to be, in most cases, a sexual form of love as well, right? And so there are these different forms of love. Certain philosophers try to reconcile or try to bring love under an overarching umbrella, an overarching paradigm of love, whereas others give in or not give in, but admit of a sort of a pluralistic notion that love takes different forms, which there may be something in common between the various forms of love, but there's great differences, right? There's great differences in romantic love and parental love, for instance. Yeah.
Do you think that, like, fundamentally there's a different, do you think in both cases, given your sort of theory about the idea of an embodied self, do you think that, and if you haven't worked this out yet, that's fine. But do you think that in the case of familial love, it's a similar kind of notion that it's an embodied person that we love? Or is it something that's slightly more, I don't know, automatic, because it's not, because, obviously it's not always automatic, because, but there's a kind of biological, push in that direction to, like, take care of your child or something like that. So do you think that it's the embodied self is still the sort of primary explanation in that case, or do you think that there's familial love just requires a kind of slightly different account?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think I want to say tentatively that, I think it requires a different account. Again, this is why I qualified it by saying I've mostly focused on romantic love, and I think embodiment comes in there. I think embodiment also comes in friendship, not in terms of, sometimes I think when we think about embodiment in romantic love, we automatically think about sexual desire in terms of the body, right? But I think the body plays a role in friendship too, without necessarily sexual desire. I think parental love, if one accepts Frankfurt's sort of characterization of love, in especially in parental love, which I think I think it's not unreasonable as a notion of parental love for the most part. I think, embodiment's going to play less of a role. It's still, the child that you love is still an embodied human being. It's just that the role of the body is going to play. But I think even there, when a parent loves a child, they're not loving the child for their bodily qualities, but there's still something. And you're right. I think part of it might be more biological and automatic, but there's still a response to the child's cry or to their smile or to their expressions, or there's still an embodied element. It's not like when the parent's loving a child, they're loving a soul or something. Even though the structure of the love, even though it's a more asymmetrical love, it's a one way. It tends to be more of a one way love, at least to a certain point.
Especially at first.
Sorry. Yeah.
Especially at first when they're younger.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, in the earlier times. I think there's the hope on the part of the parent is that there'll be reciprocation one day, and I think even there's probably the primary or the early stages of reciprocation already are taking place. Then the children are learning reciprocation in some sense. So I do think there's, and I'll confess, the biological aspect is not one that I've explored heavily in my own work. People like Carrie Jenkins in her book "What Love Is" and what it could be. Carrie Jenkins is a philosophy professor at UBC. She does talk more about the biological side. She contrasts and talks about the intersection of the biological and the sort of social and cultural side of love. I think that's an important area to explore. So I think there's some of what we talk about when we're talking about love probably can be fleshed out, or there is a biological story to tell about our relationships, and we can get those characterizations wrong too. One has to be careful. Sometimes we can use a biological story to support our own ideological, our own preconceived, our own favored. But I think also, when done well, sort of the biological story can help supplement our ideas about love and our discussion of love, for sure. Yeah.
I'm curious too, because what I find interesting is that a lot of these accounts of love seem to focus a lot on just sort of how the one person kind of feels about the other. And I'm curious if you think that there might need to be there's more that needs to be said about the sort of relationship between the two people overall, as opposed to just whether the fact that one person likes certain qualities and the other person, that's so part of what I guess I'm asking is, do you think that to some extent maybe we're just talking about attraction and not love, but then also, do you think that I'm wondering if there's something else to be said about the way that love changes over time and how it develops? And whether there's something else that needs to be said there. Like I'm thinking of, for example, my own partner, right? Who, because we've been together for so long, we have a kind of relationship of trust, and it's not just that I like or I'm attracted to my partner's trustworthiness, but that there's a more specific kind of trust that exists between the two of us that is part of what that kind of love encapsulates, I think. And I wonder if perhaps you might miss out on that by only focusing on sort of qualities from one person. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's where I think you've hit a really good point. I think this is where qualities are very much relational. I mean, trust, is something that develops relationally. It's not I guess to use probably maybe an overworn example, when a politician or a used car salesperson or whatever says, "Trust me," or an insurance, whatever, obviously, that's almost like a, they might as well have said, put up a warning flag, right? Trust is not something you just, you can automatically have with someone, right? It's something you gain over time, right? I think in some sense, love is something that, I talk, when I'm talking about certain kinds of problems in love, but elsewhere I do talk about the relational side of love a bit more. But I do think that really love is something that we talk about it as almost as if it is something that you just experience in a particular time. But really, I think you've asked the right question. I think love is something that you really know if people love each other over time and how they behave with one another, right? And how they treat one another. That there's trust there, that there's a certain kind of understanding there. But when I say understanding, I don't mean an understanding in an epistemic way. I mean, not purely. I mean it more in a practical way, right? You understand the person because you've become familiar, you become habituated with you're comfortable with the person, right? Because this is the sense in which I like to talk about practical identity. You're comfortable in the sense that there's a sense in which we sometimes use the expression a person's true self or their real self or whatever. Historically, sometimes that's been thought to mean some kind of essence, or of the person, or some kind of core, or something. I like to think of that in terms that the late philosopher Robert Solomon talked about. Talking about someone's true self, or who they really are. And Sartre, actually, Jean-Paul Sartre, French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, talked about it this way to a certain degree. What we mean by this idea of who a person really is not some essence, not some core, unchanging core that's there. But I think in some ways it's something that is revealed to us ourselves, partly through other people. And in particular, I think in a romantic relationship, in a love relationship that has endurance, that lasts for a long time, that other person helps reveal things about us, things that in some sense can only be revealed, I think, through a trusting, enduring relationship, right? I mean, there's other people reveal things to us as well, friends, sometimes enemies, sometimes teachers, but I think that kind of intimate relationship one has with their beloved, I think reveals to us something reliable, something constant. Also reveals to us some of our failings, but we come to, in some sense, see ourselves almost in a mirror. I mean, we use the image of mirror, not as a static mirror, but as a kind of living mirror, right? The person reflects something back to us that we recognize as our character, as who we are. And that's not I don't take that to be an essence. I take that to be an evolving, that who we really are, to be an evolving, changing thing. In his unpublished work, Notebooks for an Ethics, which were actually published, but not as a completed work, as they were published as
yeah, sure, okay,
an unfinished work after his death. Jean-Paul Sartre, his views of love in being a nothingness were thought to be quite pessimistic. I don't think they're quite as pessimistic as people often read them to be, but there is a pessimistic side to it. But in his Notebooks for an Ethics, Sartre took a more positive view towards love. But one of the things he talks about in that work is there being kind of a, to put it roughly, there being a kind of a passive, and this isn't the words, this is not the words Sartre uses, but there being a passive and an active side to love, right? There's a sense in which, in one sense, we're there's a passive side to our experience of love and our relationship to another person, in that we often use the term fall in love, or we become enamored with another person, or we're taken by their personality or character or their attractiveness. So love becomes something that happens to us, right? And I'm sure there's biological explanations for that. There's sociological explanations, psychological explanations, but there's also an active side, right? Love is something we do as well. It's not just something that happens. It's something that we actively engage in, right? And it seems in some sense that without either that active or passive, if we take one of those out of the picture, what we have is something not quite satisfying as a loving relationship, especially in adult, especially in adult relationships, whether it be friendship or romantic love, right? But yeah, I think you're back to your original comment. I think you're quite right that this is so that active and passive side, I think, sort of reflects the idea that love is this relational thing, right? It's something that happens over time. It involves trust. It involves sort of all these important value things that we are concerned with.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about, it's interesting to think about how like different kinds of relationships and the love that is contained therein can evolve over time. Like I was thinking about somebody, for example, who like a married couple where one of the partners ends up getting some kind of degenerative brain issue, or they end up in a vegetative state or something like that. And then so obviously the qualities and sort of certain elements of sort of who they are fundamentally change, and yet somehow a certain kind of love persists. And I wonder if perhaps, again, you have to kind of step out of the whole, well, these are the qualities or these are the sort of person that I love. There's something else maybe going on. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and different philosophers have treated this in different ways, right? Trying to explain or account for how that, what the status of that love is, right? There's an interesting. It's funny. I just at a used CD store, I bought a video of a movie that I saw years ago at the Princess called Iris, based on the life of Iris Murdoch, and in her as she as she aged and sort of began to experience an evolving dementia. The story is really, a lot of it is about her relationship with her partner and his love and caring for her, as this person who was so bright and so interesting, lost many of those qualities that were and so was from the ground of love. A certain real love continued, right? Even though it wasn't always happy pleasant for the partner, right? Sorry, I've forgotten his name. Neil Delaney has this article on romantic love and loving commitment, and his way of accounting for this is that when a person experiences dementia, when they've lost a lot of those qualities, in some sense, he wants to say it's no longer what we'd call romantic love in the truest sense, but the loving commitment that causes us to continue to care for that person is based on that love, is based on that romantic love. But the loving commitment, he wants to call it a loving commitment because he thinks that it would be weird to call it romantic love, because there's no longer that reciprocity, there's no longer that same person in an important sense, that had existed during that period that we call love or romantic love. I'm not sure. Part of me finds that compelling, but I'm not sure I totally, I'm not sure I'm totally, I recognize, it is, I recognize why Delaney characterizes it that way, as a loving commitment rather than as love itself, because he thinks the person is no longer, for all intents and purposes, the person is no longer really there in the sense that we, think of them as being the person that we love. I guess I'm just not fully comfortable with saying that we don't still love that person in an important sense, right? Maybe it's no longer romantic love, and certainly it does express a commitment. But the person who takes care of and remains faithful to the person who's lost a lot of those personal identity qualities, it's hard. It would be hard to say that's not love, we can say, as Delaney suggests, it's a love based on a memory of what was or of who they were. But it's at that point I worry that philosophy gets itself into a bit of a bind, right? Because any ordinary person is going to say, no, that's really love. my intuitions are to agree with the ordinary person or whatever, not the ordinary person, but the ordinary conception, right?
Sure, yeah.
Which I think even, and I say the ordinary person, I think even philosophers would, philosopher would be an ordinary person in this sense, right? Yeah.
Sure, and I also kind of wonder how helpful it would even, if it is such a commonly recognized sort of aspect of love, what good does it really if the philosopher comes out and says no, it isn't?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
So I'm really interested in this whole idea of replication and the non-fungibility of love, because one of the articles you sent me, there's this whole issue that Williams brings up about type token distinctions, and what if you could sort of replicate your lover? Would you love that person as that person, or would you like that person just as a sort of the type of person that they are? And your research kind of looks at the issue of both branching and non-branching forms of replication. So in one case, there's multiples of your partner, and then the other case, there's a replication of your partner, but it's just replicating that one person, right? And the interesting thing is that someone like Parfit takes that as evidence that you could replace someone's body, but if you essentially kept their mental state or their memories, all that stuff, then you would still love that person regardless, thus demonstrating that the body, I suppose, is not as important to is not as important. So what I'm interested, can you kind of explain your objection to Parfit a little bit, just in terms of you in your paper you talk about the fact that we're stuck in this body-based situation, and you seem to think you take this as being very problematic for Parfit's view. Can you just kind of explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Parfit. In that section of Reasons and Persons, am I a token or a type? Parfit's responding to something that Bernard Williams writes in, I think it's a chapter, the essay called "Our Person's Bodies." I think that's the title of the essay. And basically what Parfit wants to say is, so Parfit uses a lot of sort of science fiction examples and, scenarios, especially those that involve replication, right, of a human being. And so there's different types of replication. Replication can be used in one sense for Parfit, in one example he gives, replication can be used for the purpose of transportation. You can use a teletransporter to send someone to Mars, right? In the future, colonize Mars. And the way this teletransporter, as Parfit imagines it, works is that it takes all the genetic information and reproduces a copy of the person on Mars and destroys the original version of the body, right? And Parfit raises the question of whether this is equivalent to death of the original person, or whether it's just an efficient way of traveling, right? Parfit thinks it's an efficient way of traveling because nothing is missing, in the person on Mars. Nothing is missing there that was present in the person on Earth, right? Whose body was destroyed. So then he gets us later on in Reasons and Persons, he gets us to imagine these other scenarios where replication is done for other reasons. We could replicate a person. And here he's borrowing from Bernard Williams' example. We can replicate Mary Smith. We could have several copies of Mary Smith out there. Or we could, as a way of preserving Mary Smith's youth, that every few years Mary Smith could replicate herself, or she could produce
a young body.
Yeah, she could produce herself at a certain age, and every few years she could, start with that replicated body. You know what I mean? So that she's not aging, right? And destroy the aging body, the older body, right? To preserve youth. So Parfit agrees for practical reasons that this might pose a problem for love if there are several copies of Mary Smith's body. But if there's only one copy, right, and the original is destroyed, he doesn't see why there's the problem for love, right? He thinks under ordinary conception of love, he thinks that we should not only would we, but we should love that Mary Smith, right? There's no reason why we shouldn't love her as the Mary Smith that we had been loving all along, right? If we have to be Mary Smith's lover. So he, Williams had raised the question of Williams had thought that this might challenge our, especially in the cases of where there's multiple copies of Mary Smith. He thinks this might challenge our, threaten. I think he uses the word threaten our deeply body-based situation, right? Now, Parfit interprets what Williams says as a claim about the nature of personal identity, the nature of who we are, right? Parfit, as I said, thinks the only reason why we, it's only in the case of multiple copies of Mary Smith that we might have a problem with identifying love, the object of love. Why we might have a problem because of it might seem weird that there's 5 different Mary Smiths, right? Who do we love? Who's the real Mary Smith? Who do we love? So he thinks in that case we might have a problem, but the real problem has nothing to do with replication itself. It has to do with duplication. It has to do with the fact that love's object is divided. Mary Smith no longer seems to be this original, one of a kind, non-fungible or an irreplaceable being. But if replication takes a one-to-one relation, if there's no other copies of it, then based on Parfit's notion of personal identity and what matters in love, the mental life, the psychological life of the person is still there, then Parfit thinks we should love Mary Smith. What I claim is that I think Parfit has kind of misunderstood Williams' claim about replication threatening our deeply body-based situation, the deeply body-based situation that we actually have. I think Parfit takes Williams to mean that to be a claim about the nature of personal identity, right? And I think Williams seems to imply that this is a claim really about our ordinary conception of love, right? Our ordinary conception. What is our ordinary conception of love? Our ordinary conception of love is a bodily-based conception, right? Ordinarily, we love a person who is numerically one, who exists in one particular body, which ages and experiences, aging and disease and all of these things. This is part of what shapes our entire view of personal love, right? Is this, and so I think when Williams says that replication, in the case of multiple Mary Smiths, might threaten our that our conception of love might crack under this, and it's due to an underestimation of our deeply body-based situation or undervaluing of that. I think for Williams, this would apply not only to cases where there are several Mary Smiths, but even where there's one Mary Smith whose body has been replicated, right? Because it creates an extraordinary situation that our conception of love has not evolved for, is not equipped for in some sense, right? Our conception of love has evolved in the context of us expecting our beloved to age and die. It's not evolved in the context of our beloved being able to be replicated, being able to, remain young forever, right? So I think Williams, and I tried to in the paper give some evidence for this. Why I think Williams really is making more of a claim about love itself and the role that our deeply body-based situation plays in love, rather than the role that our deeply body-based situation plays in personal identity itself, right? And I think Parfit ignores that fact. I hope that's clear. I don't know if I made it clear enough.
I mean it's clear for me in the paper. I mean, there's a lot of interesting references that you make to, the idea that like part of the connection that we have to the person's body is that it's more reflective of an actual history.
Yeah.
And you mentioned you cite Kraut, who talks about it sort of being a sort of genuinely historical sort of relationship that you have with that person. But
right.
what I
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead. What I was going to ask is, do you think that I'm wondering if there might be a problem there in the sense that this ordinary conception of love is just based off of contingent facts? Like if say we were to develop some of these kinds of technologies, the transportation thing is really interesting because people debate about this on Star Trek all the time, right? When they jump in the transporter, does Captain Kirk actually die and get replaced with a new Captain Kirk every time? But that doesn't really, that's not really a metaphysical concern for anybody in that world, right? So is that notion of that notion of a sort of genuine history and a kind of actual history with that sort of connected body, is that something that we might just get over if a new technology were to come along? We would just change our conception of love.
It might. I mean, of course, it depends on how much. It depends on how much stock we put in, or how much emphasis we put on, or depends on what we mean by changing our conception of love. Because in one sense, if it means we're
I just mean that ordinary conception, that bodily based, if times change, would we just sort of give that up? That's I guess what I'm wondering.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. I think it's possible that we could give up that conception of love. Now, in Williams' case, I think what we mean by giving up that conception of love would be important, right? Because the degree to which we give up that conception of love may confirm or disconfirm Williams' claim, because he is saying that that conception of love that we normally have is based on what we might call this contingency of the fact that we have bodies that don't tend to replicate, or at least we don't have the current technology for replicating. I want to contrast it with another sense of replaceability or fungibility. I mean, normally when we talk about replaceability or fungibility, or irreplaceability or non-fungibility, we're usually meaning something much more ordinary, right?
Like another person.
Yeah, that's right. We usually mean that, if we really love someone, if we really love Lisa, we're not going to just leave her for Mary when Mary comes along, right? She can't be replaced by Parfit, and his thought experiments put that issue of replaceability or fungibility in a whole different light. You know what I mean? What they mean, what Parfit means by replaceability, is quite different, right? It's not the ordinary way that we want to think about it. Parfit thinks that he thinks that the sort of his historical factual factors are not what's important. Even when he talks about relation R, all right, he talks about what's important for personal identity, and he implies that what's important for love is that psychological continuity and connectedness. He says with the right kind of cause, but then he says, but that can be any cause. It can be natural historical causes, right? Your love for the person can be connected to that being the same person historically, or it can be unnatural causes or artificial causes, replication, right? Having the person being not the historically causal person that you've come to know, but a person that's been replicated, an exact replica of that person, right? There are times when Parfit almost convinces me. When you think about it in the Star Trek example, right, it makes it much more palatable, right? It makes it, when I grew up watching Star Trek, when someone gets put in the transporter and beamed to another place, even if one comes to accept that what's happening there is essentially what Parfit's, I tended to always think of that as an efficient way of transporting, a quick way of getting someone from point A to point B, right? When I think about it in the examples that Parfit gives us, my intuitions tend to be a bit split there. You know what I mean? I think I tend to value those actual historical causes, those actual historical developments, right? And I find that I feel at times that it gets glossed over, perhaps because we have the Star Trek examples in mind, right? It makes it easier and more palatable to kind of buy into what Parfit's going.
Well, when I was reading your papers, I was immediately thinking about. I don't know if you watched the show, but do you ever watch Rick and Morty?
No, I haven't. No.
So it's interesting because it's a form of I guess media that really does kind of zone in on a lot of these topics and these issues,
right.
because in the show the main scientist dude, he can jump to alternate realities. Right. And so quite often he'll sort of joke as if he doesn't care about his grandkids because they're not even really his grandkids. They're from a different reality. Right.
That's enough, Rick. What's this supposed to accomplish? We have infinite grandkids. You're trying to use Disney bucks at a Caesar's palace here.
Hey, that's a bluff. He's bluffing, sir. He loves me.
You're a rogue, Rick. Irrational, passionate. You love your grandkids. You came to rescue them. I came to kill you, bro. That's not even my original summer.
Oh my God, he's not bluffing. He's not bluffing.
There's an episode where the Rick and the scientist and his grandson kind of screw up their reality. And so their solution is to jump to an alternate reality that's identical, except they just died.
You dozen of those, I got lucky and turned everything back to normal. I just had to find one of those realities in which we also happen to both die around this time. Now we can just slip into the place of our dead selves in this reality, and everything will be fine. We're not skipping a beat, Morty. Now help me with these bodies.
This is insane.
Look, Morty, I'll grab myself, you grab yourself, okay? I mean, that seems fair to me. I mean, that seems like a fair way to divvy it up.
Rick, what about the reality we left behind?
What about the reality where Hitler cured cancer, Morty? The answer is don't think about it.
And then they just take over their lives. And so, the kind of interesting thing is, you see the shot of Morty kind of walking through his house, and he's looking at his family, You know, his own dead body is in the backyard. They just buried it. And now he's like he's walking around his house and seeing these people who aren't quite his family, right? Because they're, you know.
Everybody seems so far away from me. Everybody just wants to be free. Look away from the sky. It's no different when you're leaving home.
But over time, he, you know, as the series progresses, he kind of get, you know, at first this kind of causes an existential crisis, but he kind of gets over it. And
That out there, that's my grave.
Wait, what?
On one of our adventures, Rick and I basically destroyed the whole world. So we bailed on that reality and we came to this one. Psst.
So, you're not my brother?
I'm better than your brother. I'm a version of your brother you can trust when he says don't run. Nobody exists on purpose. Nobody belongs anywhere. Everybody's gonna die. Come watch TV.
And the interesting thing is, in the most recent season, the whole family ended up having to do this because they screwed up another reality. So the entire family had to make a jump to a new reality. But the weirdest thing is they kind of acknowledge the fact that even though they all know that they're not really related or they're not all from the same reality, they've kind of built a kind of commonality, a kind of love that they have.
I could have left you guys. You think the concept of family matters to me? I'm not even your Rick.
I'm
Denial
See you inside, Dad.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting, and I think it you know I think it probably helps us illustrate something about the idea of love that does perhaps transcend, and perhaps it does challenge what I've been saying. It does transcend our contingent reality, as you put it, our contingent historical reality. I mean, I'd have to think about it a bit more, but I do wonder if in doing that, if something has changed in the nature of love from the kind of biological, bodily, historical-based love that we have in mind. And I mean, maybe one could say that it's changed, but that's not always a bad thing, right?
Well, the other thing too is because I was wondering, imagine someone goes through the transporter or someone gets replicated, but the other person doesn't know, right? And
Right.
so if they're not aware of the change, qualitatively, experientially, it should be identical, unless they've changed, unless they've gotten a younger body or something like that. But if in that case, what would we say? Would we say that person is deluded or is under a misapprehension?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because, and I suppose this is, partly where the questions of the focus of love and personal identity partly come apart. But they, I mean, in the sense that the intentional focus of love seems to be that person is always loved, even if the actual metaphysical object, the actual object, existing in the world, the entity existing in the world, is not, numerically the same, right? I think of the movie Solaris, where I'm not sure if you've seen the movie Solaris.
It's with George Clooney, isn't it?
Yeah, in the American version, yeah, George Clooney. Where the character, ends up, through this weird scenario, ends up on this other planet, and encounters his wife who had died. You know what I mean?
Your wife, she's dead. How did you get here?
I love you so much.
and begins to experience her as his wife, before he realizes that she is somehow a replica of his actual existing wife, right?
That's not your wife. You're dreaming her.
Yeah, I mean, does the knowledge make a difference, right? Does the knowledge of what's interesting in the movie Solaris is that the knowledge that the replica has when she finds out that she's a replica, that seems to matter to her, right? It seems to really matter. Yeah. It's an interesting question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer or an authoritative answer. I do admit that I haven't resolved this to my total satisfaction. I think I did in the case of Parfit. I did want to point out. I think he misunderstood Williams in that regard in terms of what Williams was trying to do, and I think that might be significant. But maybe it turns out it's not as significant as I think it is. It's something I still need to think about. Yeah.
It's obviously it's hard to sort of know, because on the one hand I kind of think that you're right in the sense that we have certain notions of love that evolved because of the kind of species that we are and the kind of ways that we live our lives, but then if that changes then maybe we have to start changing a lot of preconceived notions we had about what love is.
Sure, and maybe love will evolve in response. I mean, love there's certain elements of love that seems to have evolved. Our ideas of love seem to have evolved in different ways. Maybe new technological possibilities would further cause our ideas of love to evolve as well. I certainly would admit that I don't have a good reason to think that's not possible.
or interesting, it could cause a strange divergence where you'd have people disagreeing about someone might say, well, I love my husband who went through the transporter or whatever, and then someone else says, no, you don't.
Sure.
That would be the philosopher.
Yes.
You don't love your husband.
That's right. You love this stranger who has the same thoughts and ideas and memories as your husband.
I mean, if you're the kind of person who believes in a soul, for example, then it may be more difficult for you to accept that. But those are based off of not necessarily what we experience, but based on our own belief sets.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I mean, I think a lot of the resistance to Parfit's reductionism, as he himself anticipated, was based on, resistance to the idea that there's not something special about us, whether it's a soul or a self or a Cartesian ego or something like that. And I think that's why, often people have a response to Parfit's thought experiments and his reductionism, a sort of negative response to that. And perhaps that's really what's going on with me, psychologically speaking. Who knows? My own residual Christianity and Platonism and so on. But I've tried to at least address the question in a way that doesn't invoke that, you know what I mean? Even whatever is going on psychologically in my defense of or my defense of a certain position, or my critique of the Parfidian position, I've tried to address it without recourse to there being something like a unique, irreproducible soul or whatever,
Well, I mean, the notion of the embodied self. I mean, like I said, I really like that the what you sort of developed there. And by the way, I actually think you did a pretty good job sort of laying out a lot of the sort of signposting in terms of like the parameters of the debate and the fact that maybe some of these concepts don't quite fit together the way that the author might have originally intended, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
but because yeah, like even the idea of somebody, people who want to clone their pets and things like that, there's an interesting question there where you might sort of say, well, maybe you're just being delusional, right? And then that kind of becomes an awkward thing, because how do you sort of say, where do you draw the line between someone being because they can't let go and they just have this need to have the dog, and they sort of deluded themselves into thinking it's the same dog and that they love it just the same. But there might be a different way to interpret that, and I suppose it's slightly worrying that you couldn't really sort of say either way per se.
Yeah, I think that what that points to, and maybe this is part of the intuition that's behind what has sort of motivated my sort of examination critique of Parfit's, is that part of what goes into to love too is that we seem psychologically constituted in a certain way, right? And this is what Parfit admits, that the idea of multiple replicas, why we would have trouble with that, because the thought that there's more than one of our beloved just is a little too hard for us to handle, right? A little too. Yes, Parfit will admit that. Where he sees the problem is with human psychology, with our practical ability to deal with that, multiple examples of or multiple instances of our beloved, rather than the fact that our beloved was replicated, right? The question is, are we constituted? Again, this is can be a fraught question or a contentious question. Are we psychologically constituted to think about our beloved as in principle reproducible in some way, right? In the case of the cloned pet, and we know of cases where people have cloned their pets. Is psychologically what's going on there? Is it a continuation of their relationship with their former pet, or is it a new relationship, right? Obviously those two questions don't have to be entirely distinct. It could be a new relationship that is parasitical on the previous relationship, right, that they had with their pet. But it seems to address we have fear of losing our pets, right? We dread that, right? Some people, I know of different people who, when their dog is aging, their pet is aging, they will get another dog to help with the transition, right? So there are these things that we do. There's a psychological element to this, right? And I guess so I guess what I'm saying, in a Star Trek universe where this feels normal and every day, the question, the psychological question, and even the question about love doesn't usually come up, right? Because it's become an ordinary part of our world, right? But in our current world, as it is, when we start to examine the question of we start to look at what might be going on behind the transporter, you know what I mean? Then we get, then we have to confront the psychological issue, and I think the issue associated with what we mean by love and love's object, right? Part of me worries that the sci-fi, the ease with which we can imagine the sci-fi examples, and partly by partly because of shows like Star Trek, which are very informative, interesting, and formative shows for many of us. The ease with which we can imagine this, I wonder if sometimes obscures some of the issues going on when it comes to love and identity, or love for a person, right?
Well, that's why I kind of find. I mean, the Rick and Morty example is a slightly more interesting one, I think, because it deals more with that kind of. It deals more with the fallout of, the long term of, like, not just, oh, this happened and we're never going to mention it again, but like a year later, where is this guy at, right? In terms of how he feels like he fits into his world. You know what I mean? And of course, it's interesting too, because I think to some extent, just because we're sort of biological creatures, after a while, we'll just sort of accept the reality that we're given, right? But I do wonder, I mean, is it possible that, after a while we would just sort of say, well, these are my family, I talk to them every day, it just doesn't strike me as being that different. But
no, I think you're quite right. I think you're quite right, and I think you're what you at least my initial response to this is that in a world like that, our conception of love would modify somewhat. It would adjust to the situation. So our ordinary conception of love would evolve as well. You got me thinking. I need to watch Rick and Morty now. It's I'm kind of intrigued.
I mean, at times it's a fairly philosophical show at times. I mean, it deals with a lot of sort of existential questions as well. Even someone like Rick, who designs the device, he has this kind of loneliness that he ends up sort of adopting, because he realizes that sort of everybody is replaceable.
Right.
And so he just kind of it just kind of sends him into this kind of existential crisis where he, perhaps maybe that's why he's so antisocial, or perhaps, but it's kind of fascinating to think about, how, long term that would start to affect the way you navigate your world and the way you understand your feelings towards certain things. And I mean, it's interesting to think about it more long term.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of another essay by Bernard Williams, the Necropolis case, which is really an essay on, immortality, or the potential problems with immortality. We have this character that doesn't die, or at least doesn't die until they decide to stop living, and they find that over time they get bored. They form relationships with people who end up dying. You know what I mean? And over time, this would make one hesitant about forming relationships. There's sort of with that thought experiment of immortality. Even you again a situation that departs from our normal bodily based, the normal history of our bodily based situation. It seems that our values, including probably the way that we love, the way that we form relationships and connections, it seems would change, right? And I took that to be William's point in that other context as well. But maybe it's that change is something in itself, which would be interesting to explore, right?
I mean, I think it's interesting. You could look at it as the bodily base, or the ordinary conception of love. This bodily base, like it's kind of necessary, just because that is the reality that we live in. But it may not sort of persist. Right?
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it still matters, because this is where we live.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
So it's not unchangeable, but nevertheless, it's perhaps might be the actual reality of love for now.
Yeah, and I think, and the reason I think why I pointed out is part of it is imagining a situation through his thought experiments where we could love a replicant, but he's doing that because he thinks the point holds for our current situation, right? And I think that's what, that's where what Williams is suggesting, I think, differs from what, both of them are using these thought experiments of involving replication. Williams thinks that the idea of replication, threatens our current bodily-based situation, or our current view of love based on our bodily-based situation. Parfit thinks that even if replication never becomes a possibility, what we learn from these thought experiments is still applicable to our current situation, right? And I think that's where the disagreement is, and I think that's probably where I wanted to challenge his ideas about love. Yeah.
Okay, so this has been a really interesting conversation. I want to thank you, Gary, for joining me this afternoon to talk about your research.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I've really enjoyed it very much. It's been great to get thinking about some of these things again. And you posed some really interesting and really helpful questions.
Well, that's what I always aim to do. It's always, no, I mean, honestly, I really enjoy being able to flesh out some of these topics, and I know you mentioned that you might be moving on other things, but maybe there's still a few issues that you might want to keep working on.
Yeah, I'm still keeping my toe in the philosophy flux. I'll still be doing some of that, even though I'm starting to work on some other stuff too.
Hopefully I'll be back soon with some more interesting philosophers to talk to. But that's all we have for now, okay? Bye-bye.